Hello, welcome to Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I am Robert, the narrator, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Confessions. This episode of Confessions, I'm going to talk about a couple or three things. I'm going to talk about Mike Merle's alternative initiative system for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, how I feel about it as a player, and how I feel about it as a game designer. I'm going to talk a little bit about the game that I've been designing for several years, have some news on that. So let's jump right into the action. So Mike Merle's put out an article, I believe it was, on Wizards of the Coast website in regards to an optional initiative system for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Found this out from Ivan Mike over at Ivan Mike 1968, and he also referenced Matt Colville, who talked about the alternate initiative system as well. The basic details of the system is that depending on the type of action you were doing on your turn, that would give you a particular polyhedral die to roll for initiative. And initiative would go from lowest roll to highest roll instead of the other way around. So if you were doing a ranged attack, you would roll a d4 for initiative. If you were doing a melee attack, you would roll a d8. If you were doing a spell, you would roll a d12. If you were doing something that wasn't any of those things, you would roll a d6. The lower the better. If you were changing gear around, that would add a plus d8. If you were doing a bonus action, that would add a plus d8. If you were moving, I think it's a plus d6 or plus d8. I can't remember, but that's generally the idea. If you had a plus d8 or something of that nature, you roll your die for your action, and the additional thing that you were doing, you add them up, and of course that generally will give you a higher initiative. So you would go later in the round. My feeling about this optional system is that it is a solution looking for a problem. I have played 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. It's on my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time lists. And I like the action economy, the speed of combat, the length of combat in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. I have no issue with the initiative. I haven't talked to anyone who has a problem with the initiative. So it really comes off as an extra layer of complexity that's not needed. The system is definitely more realistic. Matt Colville talks about the idea of even breaking it down to instead of just the type of action or the type of attack, the type of weapon that the character was using. So if they were using a dagger, their initiative die would be a d4. If they were using a longsword, I think is a d8 or a d10, probably a d8. You would use a d8 instead, so you get the same effect. And again, I think that the payoff you get in the realism of this initiative system and how it makes combat less predictable is outweighed by the added complexity. Futzing with the action economy and the speed of combat in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, I think is just not worth it. As a player and as a amateur game designer, I always get a little antsy when someone says that they want to house rule something or change a mechanic or add a mechanic to make the game more realistic. I think you start getting into rules heavy territory when you start adding rules or changing things around to make the game more realistic. Now, of course, depending on the genre that you're playing, the game has to be anchored in some level of reality. But if it starts to slow the game down or adding layers of complexity, you have to really look at if it's worth it or not. With the game that I'm working on, the level of complexity that I find suits my game is what I call action movie complexity or action movie reality. What I mean by that is I don't have range modifiers in my game. Weapons have a maximum range. If the target is within that maximum range, there's a chance that the attacker will hit. And there are a bunch of modifiers to the roll. Your ability to successfully harm someone is based on your level and the target's level. So that really is the determining factor. And the reason I find that an acceptable type of reality is, action movies. When have you ever seen an action movie where, unless it was being played for comedy or drama or tension, when have you ever seen a character say, "Oh no, I'm out of range with my weapon"? You don't see that unless it's being played for tension or comedy. Or another example is, I don't have weapon proficiencies or weapon skills in my game either. If you're a magic user and you pick up a sword, you can use a sword without penalty because you're a hero. However, that being said, if you're a warrior type, you can do more tricks with that weapon than a magic user could, but the magic user doesn't get a penalty. Again, for instance, in an action movie, when have you ever seen a hero say, "Oh no, I missed the day of training for this weapon, I don't know how to use it"? And unless it's being played for comedy or something of that nature. So I try to keep an eye on my complexity economy. I think my game is rules medium. Some may see it as rules medium to rules heavy, creeping into rules heavy. I think that comes down to preference, but I definitely, with things like I just mentioned, try to be very, very mindful of my complexity economy. And for that reason, I think that this optional initiative system, though being more realistic and adding a little bit of flavor to combat, I just don't think it's worth it with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. And that's my opinion on that. Speaking of my game, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be putting out invites to see if anyone wants to help me with playtesting. I'm going to be looking for fairly experienced gamers because, as may have mentioned in previous episodes, I have playtested my game for several months in the past, and I know that the math works, so I'm at the point where I'm just fleshing things out, cleaning things up. So I am at this point playtesting the mid tiers of my game, or levels. I have 10 levels for player characters from 1 to 10, and I'm playtesting 4, 5, and 6 right now. Of course, when you're higher level, you have more options, just naturally have more options as a player. So I think I may want slightly more experienced players, or at least players who can keep track of the additional options that just come naturally with being a mid-level character. So I really want to do that testing, maybe do some one-shots to see if I can get a group of guys who really enjoys the system and really wants to help, maybe stretch that out to a longer campaign after the one-shots. So yeah, I really want to do that. Keep an eye out if you are interested in that. And as I mentioned, my game is a fantasy game. It is high fantasy, fairly high level of magic in the game. And I think at every level, characters feel like the hero, which is something that's really important to me. So thanks for checking out this episode of Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks a lot.